Hey everyone! Welcome back to another episode of Looking Back, where we dive deep into personal stories, nostalgia, and life lessons. I'm Sarah, and joining me as always is my best friend and co host, Alex.
Hey, hey. So excited for today's episode. It's one that we've been wanting to do for a long time childhood memories. There's just something about looking back at those simpler times, right?
Oh, yeah, it's like this nostalgic mix of joy, embarrassment, and those moments that shaped us into who we are today. And honestly, who doesn't love taking a trip down memory lane?
Exactly. Plus, it's funny how different yet similar our childhoods were. We grew up in the same town but had such different experiences.
Totally. Let's start with the basics. What's the first memory that pops into your head when you think of your childhood, Alex?
Let's see. I think one of my earliest memories is probably when I was about 4 years old, trying to ride my little red tricycle. I can vividly remember the sense of freedom I felt, even though I was just going around in circles in my parents' driveway. There was this big oak tree in the yard, and I would pedal around it over and over. The sun was shining, and it felt like the world couldn't get any bigger than that little patch of ground.
That's such a classic image of childhood. That feeling of being invincible in your own tiny world. For me, it's a little different. I remember playing with my sister in our backyard. We had this old swing set, and I'd try to swing as high as I could, pretending I could fly. It was all about imagining we were adventurers, off to explore uncharted lands. You know, the usual backyard fantasy.
Oh, the swing set days. I had one too. I think every kid at some point believed they could swing so high they'd do a full loop around the top bar. Did you ever believe that?
Oh, definitely. There was always that one kid on the playground who swore they'd seen someone do it. I tried, of course, but it never happened. I mean, how could it, right?
It's funny because at the time it seemed totally possible. I remember the rush of wind, the feeling in your stomach when you hit that peak height on the swing. It was like a mini roller coaster. And for a moment, you felt like you were flying.
Exactly. And speaking of flying, or at least trying to, I have a memory of my cousin and I building a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes in our basement. We spent hours decorating it, pretending we were astronauts, and blasting off to the moon. In reality, we just sat in the box, but in our minds, we were on this epic adventure through space.
That's the magic of childhood, right? The simplest things become grand adventures. I had a similar experience with my cousins. We'd play pirates in my backyard. We had this old treehouse that we turned into a pirate ship. We'd tie a rope to one of the branches and pretend it was an anchor, shouting things like, all hands on deck and hoist the sails. We didn't have a clue what any of that meant, but it didn't matter.
That's the best part, the imagination of it all. I feel like childhood is this magical time when the line between reality and fantasy is so blurry. You could be anything: an astronaut, a pirate, a superhero, and no one could tell you otherwise.
Exactly. And then there's the way we viewed our parents, like they were these all knowing, larger than life figures. Do you remember how your parents seemed to have all the answers? Like, if something was wrong, they could just fix it with a hug or a band aid?
Yes, I remember falling off my bike once, and I was convinced it was the end of the world. My knee was scraped up, and I was crying like it was the worst thing that had ever happened. My mom came out, cleaned up the cut, put a band aid on it, and suddenly everything was fine. Like, how did that work?
Same here. I think it's because, as kids, we had this unwavering trust in the people who took care of us. They were like these superhero figures who could make anything better. I remember once I lost my favorite toy car. It was this little blue race car I was obsessed with. I was devastated. My dad helped me look for it for hours. And when we finally found it, it felt like we'd uncovered buried treasure. It was the greatest victory ever.
Oh, totally. And isn't it funny how attached we got to our toys? I had this stuffed bunny, and I took it everywhere. It wasn't even in good condition anymore. Its fur was all matted, and one of its ears was half ripped off. But I didn't care. That bunny was my best friend. Did you have a toy like that?
I did. I had a stuffed lion named Leo. And like your bunny, Leo was pretty beat up by the time I outgrew him. He had this one eye that was hanging by a thread, but I loved that thing. I think I even took him to school a few times, though I'd never admit that to anyone back then.
Isn't it wild how toys could feel like real friends? I think it's because they were these little pieces of our imagination come to life. It's like we'd project all our feelings and adventures onto them.
Absolutely. And speaking of projecting things, remember how we used to create entire worlds with something as simple as a stick or a ball? Like, a stick could be a sword, a magic wand, or a spear, depending on the day.
Yes, we used to play this game where a stick would be the key to a secret kingdom. My sister and I would roam around the backyard, pretending we were on this quest to save a kingdom from an evil sorcerer. That stick was the one thing that could open the magic portal. It sounds silly now, but back then it was the most important thing in the world.
That's the beauty of it, though. We didn't need elaborate toys or gadgets, just a little creativity, and suddenly we were in these epic stories. I remember we had this old tire swing, and my friends and I would pretend it was a spaceship or a time machine. We'd swing on it, shouting about how we were traveling to the future or the past.
It's funny how something so simple could become the center of your world for a while. And then there were those unspoken neighborhood rules, like how all the kids just knew where the best places to play were. Did you have that in your neighborhood?
Oh, yeah. There was this one hill near my house that we all called Dead Man's Hill. Very dramatic, I know. But it was the perfect place to ride our bikes or sled in the winter. Everyone would gather there after school. It was like an unspoken meeting spot, and we'd just spend hours there until it started to get dark.
We had a similar spot. It was this patch of woods behind the school. It wasn't much, just a few trees and a little creek. But to us, it was like a whole different world. We'd build forts out of sticks and rocks, and in the winter, we'd try to slide on the frozen creek. It's funny how a small piece of land could hold so many memories.
And it felt huge at the time, right? Like looking back, it was probably a tiny patch of trees, but as kids, it was this sprawling forest full of mystery.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what made childhood so magical. The world felt so big and full of possibilities, but at the same time, your little corner of it felt safe and familiar. It's such a unique feeling.
Yeah, like everything was new, and every day was an adventure. Even the smallest things felt monumental, like the first time I was allowed to walk to the corner store by myself. I was probably only going a few blocks, but to me, it was like embarking on this grand solo journey.
I remember that feeling too. There was something so thrilling about being trusted to do something on your own for the first time. It's funny how that tiny bit of independence felt like the biggest achievement.
Totally. And then, of course, there were the summer vacations that seemed to last forever. Do you remember how long summers used to feel when we were kids?
Yes, it felt like an eternity. I swear, back then, a single day could stretch out forever. Summer was all about running through sprinklers, riding bikes, staying out until the streetlights came on. It was like time slowed down, and all that mattered was having fun.
Sprinklers. I forgot about that. We used to have water balloon fights in my backyard. We'd fill up a whole bucket of them and then ambush each other. And there were always those few kids who were way too serious about it, like it was a military operation.
Oh, I know the type. We had those kids in our neighborhood too. But honestly, that's what made it so fun. The mix of carefree play and the occasional intense water balloon strategist. Summers just had this magical energy about them.
It's true. It was a time when you didn't have to worry about anything. No responsibilities, no deadlines, just long, sun soaked days of pure freedom.
I think that's one of the things I miss most about childhood. That sense of time stretching out endlessly, and the pure, unfiltered joy of just being in the moment. Everything was so simple.
Yeah, and it wasn't about having the latest gadget or the most followers on social media. It was just about hanging out with your friends, using your imagination, and enjoying the moment.
Exactly. It makes you appreciate those times even more now that we're adults and life is so much more complicated.
For sure. Childhood was this golden time where everything was fresh, and every little experience felt like an adventure. It's nice to look back and remember how magical that was.
Absolutely. And I think there's something valuable about holding on to that childlike wonder, even as adults. It's easy to get caught up in the stress of life, but sometimes taking a step back and remembering those simpler times can be really grounding.
I agree. It's like a reminder that life doesn't always have to be so serious. Sometimes it's okay to just be in the moment and enjoy the little things like we did when we were kids.
You know, Alex, as we were talking, I was thinking about how different childhood is today compared to when we were growing up. With all the technology now, I wonder if kids still play outside and have those same kinds of adventures we did.
Yeah, I've thought about that too. It's like there's been a huge shift. When we were kids, the internet was barely a thing, and no one had smartphones. Now, kids have all this access to information and entertainment at their fingertips. I wonder if they even know what it's like to be bored the way we were.
Exactly. Remember those lazy afternoons when you didn't have anything to do? You just lie on the grass, staring at the clouds, trying to make shapes out of them. That was boredom, but it was also kind of a gateway to creativity.
Yes, cloud watching was the ultimate time killer. My friends and I used to lay on the lawn and make up these ridiculous stories about what the clouds looked like. One would say, "That's a dragon chasing a knight." And someone else would argue, "No, it's a giant ice cream cone." It was simple, but it sparked our imaginations.
I loved that. We had this tree in the front yard, and I'd climb it with a book or just sit there watching the world go by. And you're right. Being bored back then wasn't really boredom. It was more like downtime for your imagination to kick in. You had to invent things to do.
Yeah, I feel like boredom was necessary. It forced us to explore, to make up games, or even to get into a bit of mischief. Like, one summer, my friends and I were obsessed with catching frogs by this little pond near our house. We'd spend hours there, knee deep in mud, just trying to catch one, and then set it free again. It wasn't something you could get from a screen. It was real and messy and fun.
That's such a vivid image. Mud covered, sunburned, and completely in the moment. We used to have a similar thing with trying to catch fireflies in the evening. There was something magical about those little glowing bugs. We'd run around with jars trying to catch them, but no matter how many we caught, we'd always let them go. It was just about the chase.
Exactly. Fireflies were like these little sparks of summer magic. We had them too, and I remember how my mom would come out and watch us from the porch. She'd tell us to be gentle with them, reminding us that they were just as much a part of summer as we were. Looking back, those moments feel almost sacred, like little capsules of pure joy.
I know what you mean. There was something timeless about those evenings. And speaking of summer, do you remember how big of a deal summer camp was?
Oh, totally. Summer camp was this weird blend of freedom and structure. It was like you were away from your parents for a week or two, but at the same time, you had these counselors telling you what to do. I went to this one camp where we'd canoe in the mornings and do arts and crafts in the afternoons. The highlight was the campfire every night. We'd sit around singing songs and telling ghost stories. It felt like a rite of passage.
Campfires were the best. I went to a summer camp once where they had this big talent show at the end of the week. I was so shy, but somehow my friends convinced me to be part of a silly skit. We dressed up as pirates and sang some goofy song about treasure. I was so nervous, but it ended up being one of my favorite memories.
That's awesome. The talent shows were always a mix of chaos and comedy. I never participated, but I loved watching everyone put on their acts. There were always a few kids who went all out. You could tell they were destined for theater. And then, of course, there was always the awkward kid who got stage fright halfway through their performance. But no matter what, everyone was so supportive. I think that's one of the best things about childhood, the lack of judgment. You could be as goofy or awkward as you wanted, and no one cared.
Yeah, there was this beautiful innocence to it all. No one was trying to be cool. We were just having fun. I think that's one of the things that's changed with social media. It seems like kids today are under so much pressure to look and act a certain way, even when they're really young. We didn't have that. We could be silly, make mistakes, and it was all part of the experience.
That's so true. Social media has made things more complicated, even for kids. I remember when the biggest drama at school was who got picked last for kickball, not how many likes you got on your latest post. There was a freedom in just being without feeling like you had to present yourself a certain way all the time.
Absolutely. And speaking of school, do you remember the first time you had a crush? That innocent, awkward feeling of liking someone, but not really knowing what to do about it?
Oh man, the first crush. I remember mine so vividly. It was in third grade. Her name was Emma, and I was convinced she was the coolest person ever because she could run faster than anyone else in class. I used to accidentally bump into her during recess just to say hi. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing, but to me, it felt like the biggest deal in the world.
That's adorable. I had a crush on a boy in fifth grade. His name was Ryan, and he was really good at soccer. I remember writing his name in the margins of my notebook, thinking it was the most secretive thing ever, even though anyone could have seen it. The butterflies you'd get just from being near them, it was such a pure, innocent feeling.
Those were the days when just sitting next to your crush in class or getting partnered with them for a project felt like winning the lottery. It was so innocent and sweet, but at the time, it felt huge.
Totally. And then there were those cheesy notes we'd pass. Do you like me? Check yes or no. It's hilarious how simple it was back then. Everything was so straightforward.
Right? And half the time, you'd agonize over whether to send the note, and then it would end up in the hands of the wrong person. And suddenly, the whole class knew about your crush. It was both the most embarrassing and exciting thing at the same time.
I know, and somehow, despite the embarrassment, it never felt like the end of the world. We just moved on to the next big thing, like the school dance or the latest playground drama.
Speaking of school dances, remember the awkwardness of those early dances? You'd stand around with your friends too shy to actually ask anyone to dance. It was always this unspoken thing where the boys stayed on one side and the girls stayed on the other, unless someone got really brave.
Oh my gosh, yes. The slow dances were the worst. You'd spend half the night hoping your crush would ask you to dance, but when they actually did, it was just awkwardly swaying back and forth, trying not to step on each other's feet. But it still felt like a huge moment.
And then there was that one teacher who'd walk around and make sure everyone kept a respectable distance. You know, the classic leave room for Jesus thing. It was so embarrassing at the time, but looking back, it's kind of hilarious.
Totally. I think those dances were less about the dancing and more about navigating all the social stuff that came with it. But despite how awkward they were, they're such fun memories now.
Yeah, all those little moments of awkwardness, excitement, and innocence. They shaped us in ways we probably didn't even realize at the time.
For sure. And as cringeworthy as some of it was, I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. They were such a huge part of growing up.
Yeah, every awkward moment, every embarrassing crush, every misstep. They all feel so cringeworthy in hindsight, but at the same time, they're kind of what made childhood fun. Like, those were the moments that shaped us, you know? They taught us how to laugh at ourselves, how to deal with rejection, and how to get back up after falling down, literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And even though it felt like the end of the world when something embarrassing happened, looking back, those were the things that gave us character. Remember how seriously we took everything back then? If someone didn't sit with you at lunch, it was like a huge deal.
Oh, for sure. The politics of the lunchroom were intense. I remember being so stressed about where to sit in middle school. There were all these little unspoken rules about who sat where, and it felt like you were navigating this complicated social web. But now it just seems so trivial.
It really does. But back then, it was everything. It's funny how things like that seem so monumental at the time, but now they're just a distant memory. I guess it's all part of growing up, learning that some things matter way less than you thought they did.
Definitely. And you know, as we're talking about all this, I realize that despite how much has changed, there are some things about childhood that are probably universal, no matter when you grew up. Like the thrill of your first sleepover or the excitement of getting your first bike.
Oh, sleepovers were such a big deal. Staying up late, eating junk food, watching movies you weren't supposed to. It felt like pure freedom. I remember my first sleepover. It was at my friend's house, and we stayed up all night trying to do this ridiculous prank call. We were so bad at it, but we thought we were hilarious.
Yes! Sleepovers always had that feeling of mischief. My friends and I would build forts out of blankets and pillows, pretending we were camping out in the wilderness. And then there was always that moment around 2 a.m. when everyone got really tired and goofy, and you just laugh at the dumbest things.
Exactly. That delirious middle of the night laughter where everything is funny, no matter how stupid it was. I remember playing Truth or Dare at a sleepover once, and one of the dares was to go outside in the middle of the night and howl at the moon. It seemed so wild at the time, but looking back, it was probably more embarrassing than anything.
Oh man, Truth or Dare was the ultimate sleepover game. It was always a mix of fun and terror, depending on the dare. I once had to prank call my crush. It was so awkward. I could barely get a word out before hanging up. But my friends thought it was the funniest thing ever. It was like, back then, that was the biggest risk you could take.
Exactly. And it was always the dares that pushed you out of your comfort zone, but in a fun way. Those nights felt like little adventures. There was always this sense that anything could happen, even if it was just in your friend's living room.
It's true. And you'd wake up the next morning completely exhausted but so happy. Because it felt like you'd lived a whole lifetime in just one night. I think sleepovers were some of the first times we really experienced that feeling of independence. Even if it was just for a night, without parents around, making our own decisions.
Yeah, they gave us a taste of what it was like to have control over our own little world, even if it was temporary. And there was something about that mix of excitement and freedom that made those nights so special. Plus, the next day, we'd always feel this bond with our friends, like we'd shared something secret and important.
Totally. Those experiences were like little milestones of growing up. And it wasn't just sleepovers. Getting your first bike was another huge one. Do you remember the first time you rode without training wheels?
Oh my gosh, yes. I was terrified. My dad took me out to the park and kept running behind me, holding on to the seat. I kept shouting, "Don't let go!" And of course, he let go and I panicked for a second. But then I realized I was doing it. I was actually riding on my own. That moment of freedom was incredible. It's like the world suddenly felt a little bigger.
That's such a universal experience. My dad did the same thing, running behind me, holding the seat until all of a sudden I was pedaling on my own. The rush of excitement and fear mixed together. It's one of those memories that sticks with you forever. Riding a bike without training wheels felt like the ultimate form of freedom as a kid.
Totally. It was like you suddenly had this new superpower. You could go anywhere on your own, at least as far as your neighborhood. I remember feeling so proud, like I had leveled up in life. Plus, biking was such a big part of childhood. My friends and I would ride around for hours, just exploring the neighborhood, finding little secret spots to hang out.
Same here. We'd ride to the corner store, buy candy with whatever change we could scrounge up, and then just ride around, not really having a destination. It was the ultimate feeling of freedom. No plan, no worries, just being outside with your friends. I think we spent entire summers on our bikes.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the destination, it was the journey. There was something so satisfying about just riding around with no agenda. It's funny how the simplest things were the most fun. We didn't need anything fancy, just our bikes and a few friends.
Exactly. I think that's something we kind of lose as we get older. That ability to just enjoy the moment for what it is without overthinking it or needing some big plan. Back then, it was enough to just be out and about, having fun with friends.
Yeah, I think that's what made childhood so special. It was this time when everything was new and exciting, and we were fully present in the moment. There wasn't this pressure to be productive or to always be on. It was just about experiencing life as it came.
And I think that's why it's so fun to look back on those memories now. They remind us of a time when things were simpler and we were just living without worrying about the next thing or the future.
Exactly. It's like a reminder to sometimes just be. I think that's why we love reminiscing about childhood. It takes us back to a time when things were a little slower, a little more carefree. And even though we can't go back, we can definitely try to hold on to some of that mindset.
For sure. There's something powerful about tapping into that childlike wonder, even as adults. It helps keep things in perspective, especially when life gets overwhelming.
Absolutely. Maybe that's why we tell these stories, to remind ourselves of what it felt like to just enjoy the little things, to be a little silly, a little brave, and a little more carefree.
Well said, Sarah. It's like we're not just looking back, but we're also bringing a piece of that childhood spirit with us into the present.
Exactly. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll be sitting around sharing stories about how our adult lives turned out, and we'll have a whole new set of memories to laugh about.
Yeah, and maybe we'll even have some new adventures of our own to share. Here's to keeping that sense of wonder alive, no matter how old we get.
Cheers to that. Here's to embracing the little things, staying curious, and finding joy wherever we can, just like we did when we were kids.
Some questions and answers based on the conversation between Sarah and Alex about childhood.
What are some of the main differences between childhood now and childhood when Sarah and Alex were growing up?
The biggest difference Sarah and Alex discuss is the role of technology. When they were kids, the internet and smartphones weren't part of daily life, so they spent more time outdoors and using their imagination. Today, kids have access to screens and digital entertainment, which has changed how they experience free time. For example, Sarah and Alex remember playing outside, catching fireflies, and building forts, while kids today might spend more time playing video games or using social media.
How did Sarah and Alex view boredom as kids? And how did it impact their creativity?
Both Sarah and Alex view boredom in childhood as a positive experience because it forced them to be creative. Without constant entertainment, they had to invent games, explore their neighborhoods, and use their imaginations. For example, they mentioned cloud watching and making up stories about the shapes they saw, or catching frogs and fireflies. Boredom became a gateway for creativity and adventure in their everyday lives.
What were some of the typical childhood games and activities mentioned by Sarah and Alex?
Sarah and Alex reminisced about several classic childhood activities, including playing outside with friends, riding bikes around the neighborhood, catching fireflies in jars during summer evenings, participating in water balloon fights, and playing with squirt guns, climbing trees, building forts out of blankets, and exploring secret spots, attending summer camps where they canoed, did arts and crafts, and sat around campfires telling stories.
How do Sarah and Alex feel about their childhood crushes? And what experiences did they share?
Sarah and Alex look back on their childhood crushes with a mix of nostalgia and amusement. Sarah recalls having a crush on a boy named Ryan, while Alex had a crush on a girl named Emma. Both of them remember the innocent, awkward feelings that came with having a crush at such a young age, like writing names in notebooks and shyly hoping to bump into their crushes during recess. They laugh about how these crushes felt so big and important at the time, even though they were mostly harmless and sweet.
What do Sarah and Alex say about sleepovers? And why were they important during childhood?
Sarah and Alex both fondly remember sleepovers as a time of excitement and adventure. They mention staying up late, eating junk food, watching movies, and playing games like Truth or Dare. Sleepovers allowed them to feel a sense of freedom, as they were away from their parents and could make their own choices, even if just for a night. Sarah talks about the giggling and fun that comes from staying up until the middle of the night, and Alex remembers building forts and prank calling friends. For them, sleepovers were important because they strengthened friendships and gave them a taste of independence.
Why do Sarah and Alex think that childhood was more carefree than adulthood? And how do they try to keep that spirit alive?
Sarah and Alex agree that childhood felt more carefree because there were no responsibilities or deadlines. They could live in the moment without worrying about things like work or social pressure. They also mention how childhood was free from the pressures of social media, which allows kids to just be themselves without needing to present a certain image. To keep that carefree spirit alive, Sarah and Alex believe it's important to reconnect with the sense of wonder and curiosity they had as kids, and to find joy in the small, simple things in life.
How did learning to ride a bike impact Sarah and Alex's childhood? And what does it symbolize for them?
For both Sarah and Alex, learning to ride a bike without training wheels was a major milestone in their childhoods. It symbolized freedom and independence, as it was the first time they could move around on their own without relying on adults. They each described the nervousness and excitement of that first ride when their parents let go of the seat. Riding a bike gave them the ability to explore their neighborhoods and have adventures with friends. And they look back on it as one of their fondest memories of growing up.
What do Sarah and Alex think was the most important part of childhood?
Sarah and Alex believe the most important part of childhood was the sense of freedom, creativity, and connection with friends. They emphasize how the simple joys of playing outside, making up games, and exploring the world around them created lasting memories and helped shape who they are today. For them, childhood was about living in the moment, without the worries or pressures that come with adulthood, and they value the lessons learned from those experiences. They also believe that keeping that sense of wonder alive, even as adults, is important for maintaining happiness and perspective.
How do Sarah and Alex feel about the simplicity of childhood compared to the complexity of adult life?
Sarah and Alex both agree that childhood was simpler because they didn't have to deal with the responsibilities and complexities of adult life. Sarah mentions how, as a kid, the biggest worries were things like where to sit at lunch or what game to play at recess. Now, as adults, there's work, bills, relationships, and social expectations to juggle. They fondly remember the freedom to just be without overthinking things, and they both acknowledge that adulthood can often feel overwhelming compared to the carefree days of childhood.
What do Sarah and Alex think about the role of imagination during childhood? And how has that changed as they've grown older?
Both Sarah and Alex agree that imagination played a huge role in their childhoods. They used to create entire worlds with simple objects, like turning a treehouse into a pirate ship or pretending they were explorers on a great adventure. Sarah recalls cloud watching and making up stories about the shapes in the sky, while Alex talks about building forts and pretending they were camping in the wilderness. As they've grown older, they feel that the demands of adult life have made it harder to tap into that kind of free flowing imagination. But they recognize the value of creativity and try to hold on to it when they can, whether through hobbies, daydreaming, or just allowing themselves to be a little playful from time to time.
Why do Sarah and Alex think summer felt so special when they were kids?
Sarah and Alex both agree that summer was one of the most magical times of childhood. Alex describes summer as feeling like it lasted forever, with long days spent outside riding bikes, swimming, or exploring with friends. Sarah mentions the freedom of not having school, where the only responsibility was having fun. They talk about the excitement of things like summer camps, firefly catching, water balloon fights, and eating ice cream cones on hot afternoons. For them, summer represented a time when the rules relaxed and everything felt possible, giving them the freedom to just enjoy being kids.
How do Sarah and Alex describe the social dynamics of childhood, especially around friendships?
Sarah and Alex reflect on how friendships during childhood were simpler, but at times more intense. They talk about how important it was to have a close group of friends and how those friendships were often centered around shared activities, like playing outside, attending sleepovers, or riding bikes together. Sarah mentions the lunchroom dynamics, where you sat and who you sat with felt like a big deal. They also talk about how childhood friendships felt like a big part of their world because, as kids, your friends are your primary social group. Now, as adults, they realize that those small conflicts and social dynamics weren't as important as they seemed, but they also appreciate the bonds they built during those years.
What do Sarah and Alex think about how their fears as children compare to their fears as adults?
Sarah and Alex reflect on how different their fears were as children compared to adulthood. As kids, they were afraid of relatively simple things, like the dark, monsters under the bed, or the embarrassment of saying something awkward in front of a crush. Alex mentions the fear of trying new things, like riding a bike without training wheels, while Sarah talks about feeling anxious about fitting in at school. Now, as adults, their fears are more complex and revolve around responsibilities, like career stability, relationships, and the future. They recognize that while their childhood fears felt big at the time, they were much more manageable than the challenges they face now. However, they also believe that facing those childhood fears helped prepare them for adulthood.
How do Sarah and Alex describe their relationships with their parents during childhood?
Sarah and Alex both describe their relationships with their parents as a mix of love, guidance, and the occasional frustration typical of growing up. Sarah mentions how her parents were always there to support her, whether it was helping her with homework or encouraging her to try new things, like learning to ride a bike. Alex recalls his dad running behind him while learning to ride a bike, and how, as a kid, he was both grateful and frustrated when his dad finally let go, symbolizing the push toward independence. They both appreciate the lessons their parents taught them and how their parents were key figures in shaping their sense of security and confidence. However, they also mention that as children, they sometimes felt restricted by their parents' rules, which they now understand were meant to keep them safe.